Hello, this is a Brighter Futures film short about how research informs policy and changes people's lives. It's a great pleasure to welcome Pete Fussey from the Department of Sociology. In this episode, we're talking about surveillance and social justice. So Pete, tell us about your research, digital sociology, human rights, surveillance and privacy, some intersections of some really big matters in our social life.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. All of those areas of thought are moving very fast. You know, when we talk about technology, it's a highly dynamic area. And as we've seen, over several years now, issues of social justice have become more prominent. So they're both very, very large and dynamic and evolving areas. The area I've really specialised in mostly is around law enforcement and security uses of technology, and what that really means, what the impact of that is on citizens, what that means for issues of social justice and human rights and so on.
And a particular focus on facial recognition. I mean, award-winning research. Tell us a little bit about that, because that had implications for agencies in the UK, direct implications, didn't it?
Yeah, so I've worked on issues of what we call overt surveillance or camera surveillance for many years. I started a PhD back in 1998 on it, and always been on the fringes of issues around facial recognition surveillance. Facial recognition is what we call a biometric technology, so it maps a feature of the body, and it's seen as more controversial and more intrusive than other forms of surveillance. So in the context of a wider programme of work with lots of colleagues from across the university and the Human Rights Centre particularly, I co-developed this work on facial recognition technology. Essentially, it's like many arguments in tech, there's a lot of heat around it, but not so much light. Mm-hmm. And one of the approaches we took was to try and generate robust academic research, robust evidence, really, empirically informed evidence on how these technologies are actually used, what the operations are and how they impact on people. So with colleagues in the Human Rights Centre, developed a kind of interdisciplinary study which matched social science with human rights scholarship to really interrogate the operational uses. And the precise research really was ethnographic research, looking at how these tools are used in practice, how the police actually deploy them, what the impacts are, and then trying to distill learning out of that to inform policy.
And we're talking about, as you said, the technology itself, how the cameras work and do they work well enough? Are they effective? But then also how they're embedded in social and political systems as well. And there's a complicated interrelationship between those things. Technology might not work and people might think it does work.
Yes.
And do something about our lives in some sort of way that flows from that.
Yeah, exactly. I think, it's probably fair to say, not exclusively, but it's fair to say there are quite dominant ways in which we think about technology, and often they're either very utopian or very dystopian. And the problem with both of those approaches is they assume that technology will function in a particular way. And we know that technology is really shaped and conditioned by the environments it's in, as you've said. So, for example, I would be in a surveillance unit on a operation, on a facial recognition operation, and the technology would issue an alert to say that someone's walked past who's a suspect, and then there has to be this human adjudication of what the technology does. Now, sometimes police were very, very deferential to the algorithm, sometimes not. And there's a whole range of individual, personal, emotive, institutional, cultural factors that really shape how technology works. And for me, I think that as a social scientist, that's one of the things I'm most interested in when we start to talk about how technology is used or how it should be regulated, is really understanding those embedded practices. And that's also surfaces issues of harm that may not have been appreciated before and so on as well.
Right, so there's upside to this, recognising problem individuals or problem contexts, but then there's also, as you say, how we as society in the broader sense are responding to those kinds of signals. So they could be, in short, good or bad, depending on the context.
Yeah, exactly. There's one quip, I can't remember who it's attributed to now, but it says that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. And value, its use is value laden and shaped by different environments. And yeah, it's really important, I think, in these sorts of debates, we often hear about a trade-off between security and liberty, for instance, or rights and safety. And it's really important to recognise that, the police or other state agencies, they have to uphold both. They have to keep people safe and uphold their rights as well. So it's really important to move beyond these very antagonistic binary ways of seeing things to try and uncover actually what happens and how, technology, if you're going to use technology, it can be used responsibly in a way that keeps people safe, and you're not just deploying technology that sucks with resources from somewhere else, which means other people aren't protected, for example, but also that it's used responsibly. And those sort of micro level things that happen that may not be anticipated in regulation are kind of captured. And that's where things like ethnographic research can really help to surface those issues.
And do you find agencies such as police agencies or other kind of agencies that are using surveillance in this kind of way, or might do they appreciate that this kind of more nuanced approach? As you said, it's neither bad nor good nor neutral. It all depends, in a sense, on the individual capabilities and the kind of policies and practices of those organisations.
Yeah, so I think it varies dramatically. I would say, it would be untrue to say that I haven't encountered a lot of evangelism about technology. One of the things that I always rail against in my work is there's this, just people start from the assumption that the technology works and it keeps people safe, and therefore it should be used. And then we're looking at ways to sort of put points of friction so it can be used responsibly. And those first questions about is it actually necessary in a democratic society to use it are often fall by the wayside. So I think that's kind of one of the problematics around this.
So you've written about the implications for public order policing, social applications in mega events, even predictive policing. I mean, these things flow into, again, another set of kind of large questions as to how we set the conditions for governing in the wider sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, predictive policing, I think, is a really interesting topic because in my view, it's massively overhyped by proponents and critics as well. Its use generally is fairly niche. I've done ethnographic work in the US with US police departments and the UK on this, and there's a fair amount of skepticism you find, particularly amongst rank and file officers who are being told to patrol in a particular space that they've, an area they've worked in for 10 years. They're very resistant to being told that externally. So there is that kind of skepticism there. But I think, the history of technology in policing is kind of littered with hubris. There's massive claims. I remember back in '98 starting my PhD where people were making claims that CCTV surveillance will cut crime by 95%, and it kind of hasn't, and it never will. So because the reason people commit crime is not whether there's a camera there or not. It's much more nuanced and complex than that. So I think linking the two questions you asked, I think that skepticism does exist. I mean, I think there is a lot of evangelism which should be challenged around use of technology. The interesting thing about resistance and those more sort of different narratives is that there's nothing consistent in them. It very much depends on individuals who have key strategic roles in law enforcement, in my experience.
And you've also written about the reinvention of suspicion, which is a kind of interesting way, because that flows from assumptions that authority might have about the effectiveness of the technology, always being able to catch the bad guys, a kind of a view of the world that may not represent the kind of the truth. But it also may mean that this might play into the roles that authoritarian regimes might have with respect to their own people. So tell us a bit about this kind of reinvention of suspicion.
Yeah, I think suspicion is something that really fascinates me, and it's certainly a project I want to take forward in my own thinking over the next couple of years, really. There's been a long, rich tradition in ethnographies and the sociology of policing, really since the 1960s, around how certain people or objects or whatever are seen as suspicious, and the discretion and the way in which prejudice and value systems feed into that decision decision making. I think when we start to talk about very intrusive, very powerful technologies such as facial recognition, it brings some other dimensions into that. So those older ways of understanding the issues are still relevant, but there are additional components. And two that I think are really important is one is about accountability. So if a machine flags somebody as suspicious, then particularly if that machine is basing that decision on very complicated technology, where is the accountability? How do you gain accountability for those decisions, particularly if that triggers then a series of action which leads to somebody being arrested or a coercive response? I think is really, really problematic. And then there's this other dimension which I think is really fascinating about how we're almost subverting what it is to be suspicious. So a lot of statute, a lot of law is about, right, so you have a particular threshold of suspicion and then that'll authorise a more invasive form of surveillance. Whereas what we see with technologies like facial recognition is that dynamic is inverted in that we're all suspicious to start with and then we have to discount ourselves, which
so
really
you need to be directly able and capable of saying, I'm not suspicious anymore, which is a different, completely different level of requirement.
Yeah, exactly. And when we trace that thought through even further, that subverts many of the ways in which we regulate technology, many of the ways in which we think about law and due process. So I think we're at a fundamental point here when we really need to think about the impact of these technologies and trace through not only what the technologies can do, but how they impact on procedure and decision making in practice.
So if you were to give us a couple of kind of headlines in terms of your lessons for policy, the top 2 or 3 priorities, might that be on oversight, expert advisory panels, ways of kind of allowing society and civil society to play a more active role? What would be your 2 or 3 kind of key priorities from this, do you think?
Yes, I think fundamentally regulation and oversight is absolutely fundamental. So often technology is put into place and technology moves much quicker than our ability to understand its impact and let alone govern it. So having strong oversight mechanisms in place that regulate, that have the ability to shut things down, that have absolute regulatory power is really important. And in that you need to have oppositional voices. We often think in law enforcement there's a public safety angle and often the bête noirs of terrorism or child protection, really important issues, but they're often trotted out as justifications, and that any attempt at regulation is somehow stopping the police from doing their work. But the whole foundation of our politics and society on democracy is to stop people doing what they want to do, is to have
fair regulations.
Yeah, to have accountability, auditable decision making and points of friction. They don't have to stop people doing things, but they have to make sure that if you're going to breach or engage the rights of individuals, it's done responsibly and with proper due oversight. And I think, linking back to your other part of your question, having civic voices in there, oppositional voices from civil society, is absolutely crucial. And an argument I have to make to law enforcement is, this is not necessarily something negative. Actually, if you want to do something that's conferred with legitimacy and gains public confidence, that's what you have to do. You have to take people with you. So that kind of wider dialogue is really, really important. But also, I think there's a fundamental another headline really is to have a fundamental challenge to technophilia on these issues. We've seen the way in which we can often see technology captures our imagination. And we can often see a lot of potential for it, but that does not necessarily mean that potential will be realised. So having a sort of the humility really to understand where the limitations might be and that we might be wrong and it may not work is really, really important. And then, then we don't really have to then get into these sort of bigger discussions and more conflict sort of ridden areas of discussion and debate.
Thank you very much. Pete Fussey, many thanks.
Thank you, Jules.
You've been watching a Brighter Futures film short. For more conversations on how ideas improve lives, pop along to our sister podcast, Louder Than Words.